Here is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. Well, coming up, something's got to give. Telstra's top brass deliver a reality check to shareholders at the AGM, defending the telco's T22 strategy and revealing that the NBN will halve Telstra profits going forward. Stop the presses. Cosmo, the magazine famed for personifying vaginas and a few other things, is shut down by Bauer. We found out why with the Australian's media writer Darren Davidson. And how does a disruptor travel in the ever-changing energy sector? Catch up with Meridian Energy Australia Chief Executive Ed McManus. Well, it's always going to be a long AGM down at the Telstra today. It's the nature of the business that questions from shareholders range from big picture to why doesn't my phone work? For those that can remember the old Yellow Pages advert, there are a fair number of not happy Jans out there in investor land. And also the big proxy investors who today decided to vote against the remuneration report and deliver the Telstra board its first strike. Well, today also, shareholders, Chairman John Mullen is nothing if not a straight talker, and his speech at the AGM today, if you weren't there, is actually worth a read, partly because it explains in painful detail why Telstra finds itself in the position it's in, dragged back by a lot of legacy assets in a new era where agility matters. But it's the NBN experience that had impacted the business both on the up, that $11 billion paid by government to Telstra, actually a lot more than that in absolute terms, and now when it's clearly a big problem.
Sadly, however, the hardest part of what we're doing is the impact that it will have on jobs at Telstra. We know that the loss of thousands of jobs will have a major impact on the company and on the lives of those affected. Let me be very clear, though. The objective is not to create a specific number of job losses, but rather it is to radically transform interaction with Telstra to a largely digital process. The job losses will then be the end result of this transformation, not the goal in itself. And so the precise number of jobs to be lost will not be clear until we complete the programme.
Well, Chief Executive Andy Penn put some numbers to the problem, not just for Telstra, but for all telcos, where he says margins are approaching zero.
The price we charge our competitors for access to our network when they provide broadband services to their customers is set by the ACCC. And on an equivalent basis to the NBN, this is currently approximately $20 per customer per month. The average wholesale price currently being charged by the NBN to the industry is $44 a month, more than double. And their plan is to increase that to $51 per month. And that is why Telstra and all of the telcos selling NBN today are facing a fixed-line market where reseller margins are rapidly falling to zero. Now, of course, you could say, well, we could just put the retail price up. But I do not believe that we can simply charge our customers more. That is not the right answer. Nor can we continue to sell NBN making little or no money as an industry. Something needs to give.
Well, Andy Penn believes that the government needs to give. Wholesale prices need to come down because that's the only way that customer prices are going to come down as well. Now, we all know the only way that's going to happen is if the government writes down the value of the NBN, something Labor has flagged as an option just this week. It'll be long overdue if it happens. But there's another reality that needs to be faced, and faced actually by investors. That was the message, I think, in the chairman's speech. A clearly frustrated John Mullen asked shareholders not to confuse share price with performance. The annual results had been in line with guidance. But what's more, Telstra paid out $2.6 billion in dividends in the last year. And since the NBN deal, shareholders have been swamped with dividends, arguably far too spoilt, arguably with cash that should have been ploughed back into the company far, far earlier to reinvent the business. But that was a decision that should have been made by the previous board and management. And there was all that pressure from big institutional investors, of course, not to do so. Now, this is my view, of course, not John Mullen's. About 15 months ago, it was Chairman John Mullen actually on this show who first hinted that something was going to have to give on dividends. He told me, and I quote, "Boards review dividend policies all the time and we live in an extremely changeable world. It's fascinating that the potential competitors of the future, not Optus or Vodafone, but more likely the Amazons of the world, don't pay a dividend." Mr Mullen's hint was picked up by the media and then the market, and the share price has been pretty much under pressure ever since. Well, today Telstra did shares. They did cop a bit of a hammering for investors. I mean, it's at its worst. It was down around 3.2% in early trade. Managed to close down a more modest 1%. Well, for more on this story, Your Money anchor James Dagger-Nixon joins me live at the desk. James, were you here at the beginning of the day for Telstra?
Yeah.
Now, and you looked through the beginning of the AGM, particularly John Mullen's speech. It was quite a watershed, wasn't it?
I have to agree with you in terms of, a clearly frustrated John Mullen, but I think a message he needed to deliver. It seems up until now that the pressure, particularly since the announcement of the dividend, Telstra has taken a position where they've essentially been trying to, on the one hand, apologise, but also try and almost meekly explain why. Well, that was a completely different message coming from Telstra today. Today was all about, listen, we've had to make hard decisions because of the situation we find ourselves in, and for all those critics out there, you clearly don't understand the pressure that we're under. You don't appreciate or understand the external factors that have led us to this decision, and you clearly don't understand the dynamic of the NBN. Everything seemed to come back today to the NBN and the massive hole that's created in the balance sheet, and I couldn't agree more with what you were alluding to before, in that the current chair and CEO find themselves at a disadvantage because of decisions that were made by a previous chair and CEO, in particular, paying 110% of profits, so actually paying more than they were earning in dividends. And at a time when Vodafone
that's a very good point.
was imploding, they had an opportunity to ram home their advantage. If they'd taken the decision to reinvest then into pricing, then into the network, they would be in an unassailable position.
This was David Thodey and Chair Catherine Livingstone.
That's right.
They were the one that did the fantastic deal, let's face it, at the time, with government on the NBN. But it's more about what they did with the cash.
It's what they didn't do with the cash.
Or they didn't do with the cash.
Instead of investing back into price, investing back into their network, then what they did was give it back to shareholders. And this gets to the REM part a little bit as well, which we'll talk about. But the idea that John Mullen is sort of frustrated, exasperated with a lack of understanding as to what shareholders want. That he suggests at the end of a piece that we'll play that this view that, well, if you want it tied back to a share price, maybe we can do that 50% base for the CEO, 50% share price. But you could make the argument that they were in that position because of the share price. David Thodey oversaw one of the highest points of a share price for Telstra, but look where that's put Telstra in the long term. Almost at the point where they're on their knees. Short-term share price movements shouldn't be the sole judge. They should make a part of it, but shouldn't be the overwhelming judge of how a executive, in this particular case the CEO, should be remunerated. There should be other incentives at play.
Well, let's have a look at that grab we've got from John Mullen.
The scheme, the transparency of the scheme, I think we've done that to death. We have talked to every shareholder, and as I say, last year they all voted for it, or majority did, and this year the same scheme is not acceptable. So I think from that you have to deduce that it's not actually the scheme, it's the outcome. So what we have to do is firstly make sure that the scheme is 100% transparent, everybody understands, which I think we've already done. We've sent a shareholder letter out. What we'll do now is sit with investors and extensively consult through the rest of the year about the outcome issue. So do they equate management performance to shareholder returns? If that's the only criterion, then we have to rethink our REM schemes, because clearly having all these metrics is not going to give a desired result.
So you could see a clearly frustrated, as we were saying, John Mullen there. Now, what about Andy Penn? Because this strategy, the T22 strategy to turn things around, some people were saying, is this the last throw of the dice for Andy Penn? Didn't get that impression from the way John Mullen was talking.
Absolutely not. I mean, he's backing his CEO, and he even went at pains to explain that Andy Penn and his leadership team are being judged by the issues, the controllables that they can impact. He can't be held to account for, things, sectoral issues outside of his control. How they respond to competition, how they respond to NBN. Yes, that is something within his control, and that is something that he'll be judged on. But the T22 strategy is a broader overlaying strategy to put Telstra in a better position than they have been against the overwhelming sectoral issues. And again, he suggested this isn't something that Telstra alone is facing. I mean, he pointed to America, to Europe. I mean, there are issues at play in the telco space that are not unique to Australia. They're not unique to Telstra. Yes, Andy Penn will be held accountable for those issues that he can actually impact.
Yeah. One thing I thought was quite interesting early up in his speech, he took a little bit of time out to talk about social licence. I thought was quite interesting, you know, and actually, in relative terms, how well Telstra had done. I mean, everybody's got a complaint against Telstra or knows someone's got a complaint against Telstra, but in terms of being relatively responsible compared to other sectors, you know, energy and banking, the telcos, you know, at the moment, there have been a few issues, obviously, with the regulator, but
no threat of a Royal Commission, though.
There's no threat of a Royal Commission. Well, exactly. So that's quite important. He did also say, though, that when it came to salaries, he could see a time when all CEOs across sectors should come down a bit.
So I thought this was particularly interesting and very much gets back to the issue of remuneration and to the point there that we heard John Mullen talking about not so much the process and the structure of the REM, but rather the outcome. $4 million is what Andy Penn was being paid, and people are railing against that as they see the destruction of shareholder value. However, what Mr Mullen points to, saying if Andy was in a similar position at a US telco, he'd be paid $200 million. It's about expectation, where you are in the market, but if everyone wants to have a wholesale discussion about capping shareholder pay to what a multiple of what the average wage in Australia, well, let's have it. But you need to take into consideration there could be some negative consequences, i.e. attracting talent as a result.
Few people suggesting that. James Dagenixon, thanks, and thanks for today, the whole of today. Now, yesterday we talked about this high-stakes by-election in Malcolm Turnbull's old seat of Wentworth, which is coming up this weekend. It's been held with a 17% margin. Well, not any longer. The Liberal candidate, Dave Sharma, is up against popular independent Dr Karen Phelps. And with the backlash from voters who are disgusted with their former Prime Minister being dislodged, things are quite tight. Well, yesterday I said to expect the Morrison camp to pull a rabbit out of the hat before Saturday, and whoop, here it is. Today we hear Scott Morrison could follow US President Donald Trump's lead and move Australia's embassy in Israel to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. And he's been consulting who? Well, Dave Sharma as the former Israeli ambassador. Scott Morrison says new ideas are needed to achieve a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. The Jewish vote in Wentworth is well over 10%, but the influence of the diaspora is anyone's guess. Mr Sharma has already been on the front page of the Jewish News, I think. Well, for more, I'm joined by Sky News political reporter Annalise Nielsen, who joins me live from Canberra. Annalise, this is a very interesting development. Now, the government presumably has said, though, no, there's no connection at all.
Oh, absolutely. We had complete denial from the Prime Minister today, but he did say that he had received advice from David Sharma about whether the embassy should be moved, but he said this was a long time ago and it was just something that's been on his agenda, so he decided to pull it out today, and what a rabbit to pull out of a hat, because it really does have so many global implications. And the interesting thing is the observations are being made today that that Jewish population was probably going to vote for David Sharma anyway if they were if they were so passionate about that connection. And so it remains to be seen about how much influence it will actually have. But the other interesting question is the fact that he hasn't announced that the embassy will move. He's announced that he's going to enter discussions and consider it. And so it puts Australia in an interesting position, because presumably if we backtrack on it, it could upset the Israelis. And if we go ahead with it, of course, it's going to upset many within the Middle East. But we did catch up with the Israeli ambassador, Mark Kofer, as you can imagine. Shortly after this announcement, he was promptly into Parliament House, and he said that if the decision doesn't go ahead, if they don't go through with it, there won't be any hard feelings.
Jerusalem for us always has been, is and always will be the capital of the State of Israel. It's a recognition of the fact that the debate is a healthy one. We welcome it, of course, that we are moving in the direction. Hopefully the decision will come sooner rather than later. Australia is a close friend of Israel. It doesn't matter which party is in power. We've always had a close friendship over the years. We've always interlocuted with each other. We've always interacted with each other on all levels, on the political level, on the bureaucratic level, on the wider public opinion level. And I think this will continue. It should continue. That's what friendly countries talk about. That's what they do.
Now, always playing back into Wentworth again here. I mean, you make the point that probably Jewish voters would vote for Dave Sharma, but equally, doesn't it actually potentially pull out Karen Phelps to make a comment? And what's going to happen to all those, slightly more wobbly voters as far as the Libs are concerned, who are traditionally more green, more left? I mean, does it actually pin Karen Phelps down in the other direction?
Well, I suppose it would in a way, and especially if she did decide to go the other way. We know just how toxic this issue can be. It's so sensitive and it's such a volatile area. But the thing is, like we were discussing yesterday about the fact that there aren't a lot of bread and butter issues in this electorate because it is quite well to do, but there is a significant portion of the electorate that does have issues with access. I think there was a report about like 20 or 30% of people in the electorate have rental distress because the rental prices are so high. And so it does also pose the risk of just becoming a bit of a red herring topic where it's so far off the average person's radar about the things that they want to see done from their government. It does seem like it is a bit of a distraction, but it's certainly something that's caught a lot of people by surprise today.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some strategy there behind it somewhere. Now, Annalise, something actually did go rather wrong as well today on the government side with Pauline Hanson's bill that she was trying to get through.
Oh, this was just an absolute doozy. When it came up last night, you could just see the coalition members in the Senate wondering what on earth was going on. We got this really short statement saying, oh, we don't support any kind of racism, because I think most of them were just completely blindsided by the fact that this came up. But they really shouldn't have been, because Pauline Hanson trying to get this...
It's okay to be... Pauline Hanson's it's okay to be white.
Oh,
this
sorry.
Was the motion. Yeah. No, sorry, just get it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've been up to my eyeballs in it all day. Forget that most people wouldn't have heard about it. So she did pass this motion saying it's okay to be white. The thing is, a lot of people don't realise the ramifications of passing a motion saying it's okay to be white. This is the catch cry of white supremacists in the United States. This is a phrase used often by the Ku Klux Klan, and it's been plastered over university campuses that have had issues with racial tension. And Pauline Hanson denied that she realised that connection. She said that she just thinks there's a rise in anti-white racism, so she was making that point. She says it's absurd to say that it should be any connotation like that. But the thing that just shocked everyone was the fact that the government supported it. The government instruction to senators was, we're voting for this one, because they all get a list. There's dozens of things they vote on each day, and they said, yep, voting for this one. The excuse from the Attorney General has been that his staff saw the list and they just saw a motion against racism, and they didn't look any further into it. But many on the Labor side are saying, if you see Pauline Hanson saying that there's a motion against racism, maybe read on. Maybe don't just tick that off. So that's been the huge backtrack today. We've seen it handballed all over the place. It started with the Prime Minister saying it's the leader of government business. Then we have Matthias Cormann say, oh, no, Attorney General, it's up to him. And then the Attorney General's now pushed it onto his staff, saying if they'd raised it with him, he would have realised and then he would have done something about it. But it really is just an absolutely extraordinary thing to happen. And they did have another vote on it, so the government could have a chance to vote it down, but I don't think they'll be able to vote away the embarrassment that's come from it.
Yeah, very interesting development. All right, Annalise Nilsson, a really interesting day in Canberra. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now, after the break, the end of Cosmopolitan magazine's 45-year stint in Australia. We'll get the goss with the Australian's media reporter Darren Davidson.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, another day, another magazine closure. This time it's the end of an icon. The latest casualty is Cosmopolitan, a 45-year-old brand in Australian women's magazines, coming to an end. Bauer Media CEO Paul Dykesel broke the news to staff today, saying, magazine closures are never easy, desirable or done without careful consideration for all those involved. We have to ensure that we're continually reshaping and defining the business so that our readers of today and those of tomorrow remain engaged. Well, for more on this story, I'm joined by the media editor at The Australian, Darren Davison, at least for the next 2 weeks, before you head off to the US.
Outgoing media editor.
Yeah. Yes. Well, look, this is a bit of end of an era, really. I mean, it was such an icon, the Cosmo.
That's right. It's actually, its roots go back to the 19th century in the US, and it's been published by Bauer. Before that, ACP, once owned by the Packer family, locally for 45 years. And it's had a profound impact on young women. It's aimed at women between 18 and 34. And in the 60s, it kind of reinvented, or was part of that reinvention of the conversation that young women were having at the time with some...
Well, it had to have the word sex in the title, didn't it?
That's right. It tackled those subjects in a way that no one had before, often in a very frank, brash way, and sort of paved the way for much of the kind of the women's publishing world that we know today.
And then also so famous for the full frontal of Burt Reynolds.
Yes, yes.
You know, who also died recently.
He did.
You know, he was. The magazine outlived him. Just bless him. But you know, a bigger question here, I guess, is that this is the inability of, say, Cosmopolitan magazine to translate online.
Yeah, I mean, in its heyday, it sold millions of copies in the US. And then, by the way, I should say the US edition is still going. This is the local edition that's being closed. But I think it's another sign that Australian women's love affair with print magazines in Australia is very much under threat. We've had a string of closures, not just at Bauer, but other publishing companies locally over the last, probably dating back to 2013. There's been, you know, scores of them every single year. We've had Dolly, Clio, others go as well.
Yeah, is this because other disruptors have come in online, or because they couldn't actually do the online change well enough? Because it's a subscription online you'd be looking for, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, I mean, the internet is definitely a major part of the story here in terms of their demise, and time that was once spent with these magazines is being sucked up by social media and other forms of entertainment that women are now spending their time with.
Because they had a new editor put in only just a couple of months ago at Cosmopolitan.
That's right, yeah. And I think, and she's found, as many have found around the world, it's very hard to reinvent women's magazines at the moment. And they, you know, some of them have successfully developed, you know, adjuncts to what they do online, new digital platforms and stuff like that, but they just can't monetize them in the same way they can or could the print format.
And is this something that Bauer is going through? Because, of course, Bauer is the German, massive German private company, still owned by the Bauer family, is it?
Still privately owned by Yvonne Bauer and her family, run out of Germany. They have huge operations in the US and UK, major commercial radio operator in the UK.
And hundreds of magazines.
Hundreds, well, around the world. They're the biggest magazine publisher in the US, actually. So, while they've had a very tough time over here in Australia since doing that deal when they, David Gingell, the then Nine CEO, sold what was then called ACP for $525 million to the Bauer family back in 2012, 2013. They've really struggled, coming under pressure on the circulation front and the advertising revenue front. We've now got this duopoly in the digital advertising market. They've closed a string of magazines. They've found it very tough here. They've talked about moving into radio and other parts of the media sector, but it hasn't happened for them yet. And they continue to publish Australian Women's Weekly and have quite a successical events business.
Well, that really would be a shocker if the Australian Women's Weekly were to close.
That's a huge, iconic title.
Yeah.
Iconic. It's banned
all those
around
recipes.
A lot, but that's right. But it still is an iconic magazine. But I don't think it'll be the last, though, to close Cosmopolitan. I'm sure others will be under threat as well.
Well, Vale, Cosmo, Darren Davison, thank you very much.
Thanks.
OK. Well, switching to political news now, and the Treasurer here has caved into state and territory demands for a legislated guarantee that they will not be worse off under a new GST carve-up. The new GST package will see a floor of 75 cents per person per dollar of GST distributed, which will particularly boost Western Australia. But the states were critical of the fact that the new carve-up contained no guarantee they'd be worse off in the event of an economic downturn. Josh Frydenberg today announced a compromise to guarantee no state worse off through transition period until 2026-27. Well, the government has also ordered a further review by the Productivity Commission after 2027 to ensure the system is working efficiently.
Reports that the Treasurer has buckled to Labor's pressure to ensure the guarantee is written into the GST distribution legislation is a humiliation for the Treasurer and the Prime Minister. I called for this to be written into the legislation when it was first released.
Yeah, so quite a big development there. Well, a legal loophole has also allowed Assistant Treasurer Stuart Robert to get out of paying $9,500 for misusing taxpayer funds. Last week, Mr Robert repaid almost $38,000 for using taxpayer money on his home internet bill. Government classifies MPs' internet entitlements as remuneration rather than public resources, meaning the Assistant Treasurer faced no penalty. Now, high-speed trains look to be a crucial battleground in the Victorian state election, with a series of announcements from the Andrews government. A lot of money around. Labor will spend $100 million for faster regional rail, while also announcing its preferred route for the airport train.
It's beginning to feel a lot like a state election as both parties ramp up their spending commitments ahead of the November poll. While the ill-fated East-West link dominated the last Victorian election, this time, so far, it's all about trains.
This is a proper, well-considered, well-thought-through plan that comes from the advice of experts and will be delivered only by a returned Labor government.
The Premier went to Geelong promising faster trains to the city, a decade-long plan to separate Melbourne and country trains and pave the way for 250 kilometre-an-hour services.
And these are the projects that will give all Victorians, no matter where they live, more choices about how they move around the city or state.
If re-elected in November, Labor will spend $100 million on detailed planning, and construction would start as early as 2022.
This is about giving back to regional Victorians dedicated regional track so that they're not competing, every V-line train competing with metro trains in the fastest growing part of our city and indeed our nation.
Labor's trying to now match the big spending coalition plans to bring European-style fast rail to Victoria's regions. There are now just weeks to go until the Victorian state election campaign, both Labor and the coalition turning their attention to population growth and regional rail. It's part of a suite of projects aimed at catching up to Victoria's population growth. The government's now settled on a tunnel for the airport rail project to be built between the city and Sunshine.
Those investments are all about making sure that we have capacity in a logical, sequential way to run more services and to run them more often.
Another massive project for a city already a huge construction site. Aaron Young, Sky News, Geelong.
After the break, talking disruption to the highly complicated energy market with Meridian Energy and Powershop Australia CEO Ed McManus.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Welcome back. Well, a lot of dust kicked around last week on energy policy. So as that dust settles, we thought we'd go back to some of the developments which could make a big difference to how energy security and indeed energy prices in Australia will firm up. Ed McManus represents one of the disruptors in the energy space here. He's CEO of Meridian Energy's Australian business, which includes Powershop. I spoke with him a short time ago. Ed McManus, nice to see you again, having talked to you last week. Tell us a bit about Meridian in New Zealand and what it's doing here.
Meridian in New Zealand is a very large generator of electricity, hydro and wind, and a retailer, one of the larger retailers there through two brands. You can buy your electricity in New Zealand from Meridian as well as from Powershop.
And it's open and it's owned by the government?
51% government owned, the rest is listed on the NZX and ASX here.
And it's pretty big? From New Zealand, in New Zealand?
It's a big business. It's one of New Zealand's largest businesses. And then Meridian Energy Australia, which is the business I run, headquartered in Melbourne. We operate a number of wind farms and hydropower stations, and we have a retail business called Powershop, which provides electricity to about 110,000 electricity and gas customers.
And you're planning to grow?
We're planning to grow and expand in both retail and our generation activities.
OK. Now, Ed, you yourself have worked in a few sectors now, but this is the most complicated you've come across, especially in Australia?
Certainly. I've worked in pharmaceuticals and digital media.
Well, that's pretty complicated.
It is, with a long pipeline, but I got to say electricity trumps it in terms of the complexity of the physical complexity, engineering and physics, the financial market, because electricity settles in a volatile financial market, as well as, of course, dealing with consumers, and I like dealing with consumers,
yes,
who have complex needs and different needs, both large and small residential consumers.
So last week there was a big energy summit at the Financial Review. We had a big session on energy at the Australians Outlook conference down in Melbourne with Kerry Schott, amongst others, who chairs the Energy Security Board. She talked about the landscape, really, the whole thing being in chaos. And it sort of struck me, if the person who's chairing the Security Board talks about chaos, that's slightly worrying.
It is, but having said that, I think there's a lot of positivity too. We've come off a record year in terms of investment in new forms of generation.
Yes.
Lots of companies, including ourselves, invested, and as a result, actually, we lowered prices to our Powershop customers.
But that's part of the problem, all this creation of new generation and how it finds its way into the grid in terms of creating a secure grid, yeah?
It's a challenge. It's certainly a big challenge, but I think the regulators and the industry participants are up for that challenge. We have to be, because we need to deliver reliable power in a system that is secure at an affordable price, and at the same time decarbonise the sector to meet our Paris commitments.
So how are we going to, just on securing the grid for a moment, how are we going to make sure that not too much renewable energy becomes part of the essential mix? And we're looking at, say, the next, 20 years or so, at a time when we think we've got these traditional power stations, dispatchable coal and even gas, but we're hearing now that putting a lot of renewables, or perhaps too much, into the grid means that the business model for these power stations is being hollowed out.
Yep.
How do we make sure that we don't push too much renewables through?
Yeah, well, look, any power station, including renewables, has a limited lifespan. And the issue we face in this country is that the vast majority of our coal-fired power station fleet is nearing the end of its useful life.
But we'll get there by 2050, like the IPCC says.
Well, in the next 10 to 20 years, we've already seen one big coal plant close in Victoria.
And that led to a big jump in prices?
Well, it did, because not much notice was given.
Yes.
So it goes to the point that the closing of these plants over the next 10, 15 years needs to be managed very carefully.
But then if they're hollowed out in the middle and they don't make any money for those owning them, that creates a new level of complexity, doesn't it?
It does create a new level of complexity, but bear in mind the companies who own them, we saw some of them speak last week, are all pointing, as we are, to renewables as part of the future, because the simple financial facts are the cheapest form of new generation to replace the power stations that inevitably will close is wind and solar firmed up with other forms of dispatchable generation.
Right, so this is the key thing the Energy Minister Angus Taylor was talking about last week, this idea of firmed up dispatchable energy. So it's as good as, you know, your coal or your gas. It can operate when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Now, how far are we away from delivering, you know, cost-effective firmed-up energy?
Well, depending on the comparison, we're there today. Right. So nothing in any market is cheaper than the assets you already have that are fully depreciated.
Yes.
And that's what we have today in terms of our coal plants. As I said a moment ago, inevitably they will close. We can't stick our heads in the sand on this. We've got to manage the transition very carefully.
But let me put it to you this way. What's cheaper at the moment? A new, producing the same amount of energy, a new firmed up renewable energy plant, or a brand new coal power station?
There's no question, based on, and this is my opinion, based on the investments we've made recently and the contracts we see in front of us today, it's new wind or solar firmed up. Now, the other very important factor
that is a big jump, isn't it?
Well, it's an
in terms of where we are now.
Yeah, and I should say, new wind and solar firmed up. It's more expensive than the coal we have today.
Yeah.
But
because that's written off.
Right? But compared to new coal, it's cheaper. And the other critical point is we can start a new wind or solar farm firmed up today and be ready to generate in 18 to 24 months.
Yeah. But so basically what this means is that Tony Abbott can jump up and down as much as he likes about supporting the coal industry, but in reality we're not going to have, industry's not going to build new coal power stations in this country.
We're certainly not, and many of the major industry participants, like you heard last week, are saying they won't. It's possible someone will, but they would have to face the following challenges: a 6 to 8 year time frame.
Yes.
2 electoral cycles at both a federal and state level through that time.
Yes.
Uncertain future on carbon pricing, questions on financing. All those factors coming together would suggest it won't happen.
Right. Okay. The other thing that's been going up this year and last year is government intervention. Now, at a couple of levels, let's talk about the NEG itself, because that was thrown out, the National Energy Guarantee. But we're now looking at Angus Taylor bringing in this reliability mechanism. How is that going to change the game for the players?
Well, that was one part of the original NEG design, NEG 1.0, and now we're talking about NEG 2.0.
Half of it.
Half of it. And it's an important half because, as you point out, in the future, with lots of intermittent forms of generation, we may see reliability concerns emerge, and we need a mechanism to manage that. And I feel the Energy Security Board, working along with industry, did a really good job at designing a mechanism, which is the reliability component of the NEG. And that, in our view, should go through so that these reliability concerns, if and when they emerge in the future, can be managed.
So that could involve, for example, government supporting firmed-up energy by underwriting
not necessarily. Well, that's a separate recommendation of the ACCC.
Do you think they might take it up, though?
Possibly. You'd have to ask them.
Yeah.
But look, I think what's
important...
Well,
I did, and the Energy Minister didn't tell me last week, so we'll see.
Well, I think they've said it's under consideration, and it's got some merits and there's some issues with it. But importantly, the way the NEG will operate is if the market operators see a gap emerging in terms of reliability, they will put an obligation on retailers like us, like Powershop, to say you must now procure some of your energy from dispatchable sources, and that is a really good mechanism to manage reliability concerns if they emerge.
Ed, what about this idea that was sort of floated last week about, well, Kerry Shop mentioned that really the other half, from an investment certainty point of view, the other half of the NEG, which is what are we going to do about some sort of emissions target, needs to be sorted. Now, whether that's sorted within COAG or whether that's sorted within business, then it emerged that business, actually, the BCA and the Energy Council had been talking about this.
Well, look, as I understand, those discussions are very preliminary. But
embryonic, I think, was the word.
Embryonic, sure. And the logic is we have had a lack of stability on carbon policy in this country for many years now. And are we likely to get stable bipartisan policy in the next 10 years? And that's pretty uncertain.
Be a miracle. Let's face it.
Well, I think so. And I think in light of that, people in business and the industry,
Can you see it getting up from all?
Well, I think so, because remember that the industry broadly and the energy industry, by and large, the vast majority of people were behind the NEG in terms of both the reliability and the emissions component. And so very unusual, very hard to think of a policy area where so many people were behind something. It didn't get up, and so participants are now saying maybe we go it alone.
That leaves us with, which is relevant to Powershop, the intervention on the retail side, which is, again, the Energy Minister looking at some sort of reference price, he says, so that we don't have unanchored discounts, essentially, that there is some sort of across-the-board reference price. What is the worry about that turning into a cap from business point of view?
Well, let me first say, in most markets, consumers pay different prices depending on level of product or service quality.
Yes. But couldn't there be a vanilla comparison?
Well, unusually in this market, what more than anything characterises how much you pay as a consumer is whether or not you engage in the market. So if you've switched recently, you're on a good price. And if you've not switched at all or haven't switched for several years, you tend to pay more.
A loyalty tax.
A loyalty tax. There are some retailers, including Powershop, who have a different model where all our customers get the same price or access to the same price, so there's not the loyalty tax. But the problem in this industry is that many of those in society who are most vulnerable will be the people who can't engage in this market. And we've made it too complex. The industry has made things too complex. It's difficult to engage. We absolutely support the reference price, so that a 12% discount from Powershop and an X% discount from a competitor of ours, another company, can be compared. That's not controversial. If that turns into a default rate, which is a form of price capping, there are a number of issues. And we've got to consider those issues extremely carefully. The biggest issue is that it may cause companies like us and others who have said the same thing to reconsider investments in generation.
Yeah, because you're all vertically integrated.
We're vertically integrated, and investments in generation are key if we want to bring the price down.
Okay.
So I understand why the ACCC recommended the default rate.
Yes.
I completely understand why governments are looking at it.
Yes. So industry better behave itself, is what the ACCC is saying.
Sure, but I think we need to consider these issues carefully.
Yeah. Ed McManus is a great space. I love talking about it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So that's New Zealand investing in Australia there. Let's go over the ditch. The New Zealand MP accused of leaking the travel expenses of his own party leader has made explosive new allegations. Jamie Lee Ross has accused Simon Bridges of being a corrupt politician and of breaking electoral donation laws. The Nationals leader has rejected the claims as baseless and false.
A day after being pinpointed as the leaker of his party leader's travel expenses, Jamie Lee Ross is taking his attack on Simon Bridges to a whole new level.
Simon is a flawed individual, without a moral compass and without any underlying principles except power.
Jamie Lee Ross denies being the leaker, but Simon Bridges says he can't be trusted.
And that is a lone wolf MP who has lied, leaked and done some appalling things, and that the National Party is now going to move on and try and put this behind them.
As Jamie Lee Ross announced he would be resigning from the National Party and Parliament, caucus voted unanimously to expel him anyway.
I was once close to him. I know what he's like now, and I know that many people in the caucus, my now former colleagues, share my view.
Mr Ross now alleges Simon Bridges used him to break up a $100,000 donation from a wealthy Chinese businessman into smaller donations to avoid disclosure requirements.
They are baseless. In relation to the Electoral Act, they are entirely false.
Jamie Lee Ross will lay a complaint with police on Wednesday and hand over a recording of a phone conversation he claims he has between the pair. Simon Bridges says he hopes the investigation will be thorough and prompt and is adamant it will clear him of any wrongdoing.
But there is zero chance of me having done anything illegal, I can guarantee you that.
Jamie Lee Ross's departure from Parliament will force a by-election in his seat of Botany, which he will contest as an independent candidate. He says he is seeking a new mandate from his community. Jackson Williams, Sky News, Wellington.
Let's keep heading east across the Pacific. US President Donald Trump and his wife Melania have toured some suburbs in Florida devastated by Hurricane Michael as tens of thousands of businesses and homes wait to have their power restored. CNN's Camilla Burnell has more on the story.
Just making sure everyone's safe, that they're fed. You know, many of these people have no home. Some of them have no trace of a home.
5 days after much of the Florida Panhandle was torn apart by Hurricane Michael, President Trump is in the state to see it firsthand. Joined by the First Lady and Florida Governor Rick Scott, the president first took an aerial tour of the devastation. From there, the Trumps went to a distribution center to help pass out supplies.
The governor of Florida, Rick Scott, has done an unbelievable job.
Thousands across the region are relying on donations and government assistance for necessities like food, water, and shelter, and several are still missing. FEMA-approved transitional sheltering assistance for families in Bay County, Florida, one of the hardest hit areas. This will provide survivors short-term lodging if their homes or communities have been destroyed. Residents of 10 other counties are also eligible for individual assistance.
Damage is so widespread. We've registered over 20,000 people already in individual assistance within FEMA.
And Trump has pledged the areas impacted will have all the help they need to get their communities back up and running.
After the break, it's crunch time for British Prime Minister Theresa May, with plans stalling ahead of a crucial meeting on Wednesday. We get the latest with London's Capital Group's Jasper Lawler next.
Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, British news continues to be dominated by the Brexit talks, which are struggling to reach agreement over the Northern Ireland border.
A make-or-break week for Brexit negotiations has not got off to a good start. The UK and EU are no closer to a deal following stalled talks at the weekend. Not that that stopped the UK Prime Minister Theresa May striking an optimistic note a day later in Parliament.
This is the time for cool, calm heads to prevail, and it's the time... And it is the time for a clear-eyed focus on the few remaining but critical issues that are still to be agreed.
Those issues will be put to the test on Wednesday when May meets EU leaders in Brussels. Perhaps the most crucial one is the fate of the Irish border after Brexit, the UK's only link by land to the EU.
We have made progress on Northern Ireland, where, Mr. Speaker, the EU have been working with us to respond to the very real concerns we had on their original proposals.
Although exactly what the alternative is not yet clear, and with the UK and EU hoping Wednesday's meeting paves the way for an agreement by November, time is running out.
You could easily imagine a scenario where that last-minute deal-making just goes completely awry and everyone falls out, and then we're into no-deal territory, and that is, I think, very negative for markets.
That outcome is being planned for, says the European Commission. The German Chancellor, too, has weighed in on the debate, saying clinching a deal is looking more and more difficult.
Well, that's not really good news, is it? For more, Jasper Lawler, Head of Research at London Capital Group, joins me live from London. Jasper, it's all about the Irish border, and it looks very, very tricky, doesn't it?
Well, good morning from London, Ticky. Yes, I mean, I remember we were speaking just a week or so ago and everything was looking rosy. I made the easiest prediction ever that that wouldn't last. And obviously we find ourselves now again talking about this Irish border. I was, and again, many people probably were as well. It was quite easy to see this problem with the Irish border, as you said, just still hasn't really been resolved. And Theresa May, I think, has come to the realisation that again, a lot of people saw was that she just didn't have the support within her government for this backstop arrangement, whereby essentially either the UK remains tied to the European regulations and import and export rules for an indefinite period, or at least Northern Ireland is then separated from the rest of the UK, neither of the two scenarios are really palatable politically, and so Theresa May has in fact capped these EU negotiations, just knowing that she doesn't have the support at home.
Well, I think it's hard if you don't know much about Northern Irish history. It's hard to see why this is such a big issue. But apart from the fact that Theresa May's got a few votes that she needs to, look after in Northern Ireland, I would say, it is, there's a lot of history there with Northern Ireland, and so to basically sort of recognise the island of Ireland, I would have thought would be very politically fraught. And I see actually Lord Hague, William Hague, who we'll be talking to tomorrow, he's in Australia. He writes in the telly today saying he's very worried because the most concerning development, he said, as the weekend was the apparent threat to quit their post by the Scottish Secretary, David Mundell, and the Scots Tory leader, Ruth Davidson. Do you see that as a concern?
Well, I think the fact that the Scots are involved in this is just symbolic of the fact that this is really critical to the Union, to the United Kingdom staying together, Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. And if there is, as I said, if we have to find ourselves in a situation where Northern Ireland remains, in order to keep that border open for the historical reasons you've been alluding to, if Northern Ireland is kept separate in essence from the rest of the United Kingdom, trading on EU rules as opposed to UK rules, it obviously is the first step towards Ireland breaking away. Then you have Scotland potentially, then you have Wales. So this is a situation that really can't be allowed to continue for the good of the United Kingdom, if you believe in that.
Right, yeah, OK. So where does this leave Theresa May now? She's got a cabinet meeting, I think, coming up this morning.
Well, there's going to be a crunch cabinet meeting. There's not a lot she can do. I mean, all she can really try and do is garner support for the arrangements that she already has in place. But in essence, as of yesterday, she's basically told the EU that she's not going to be pressing forward with their suggestion, which was based on her own Chequers arrangement. So this backstop idea for the Northern Ireland border, she wants something more permanent. So I don't see how in the last minutes before this Wednesday meeting, where it was hoped that everything would be ironed out and agreed, I can't see how she's going to be able to pull together a new permanent solution that avoids backstop. Just to explain a bit more, whereby the border is essentially kept open between the UK and the EU while some other solution is found. Obviously, some other solution may never be found, and you find yourself in a situation where Brexit, in effect, hasn't happened. So. In the space of 2 days, I don't think much is going to happen. She can only rally a bit of support. I don't think she has the numbers, though. I can only assume she thinks that. That's why she said what she did to the EU yesterday.
Right. So how many more times between now and March can we have some sort of last-minute potential deals and last-minute potential deals before the deadline? I mean, there are, after all, I know it's coming up, but there are, what, 4 months between... well, 5 months between now and March, so presumably there can be more negotiation done, can't there?
Plenty more can kicking to be done, I think that's fair to be said. We were hoping for October, that's obviously shifted to November. Now there are talks about December as being a deadline to agree something, so I think you're probably right. I mean, they do have until March 2019 to really come together with the full divorce agreement. And I think this is something we've been saying from day one, is it probably just has to come down to the wire, so that both sides, in the realisation that a no deal really could happen, is when they begin to compromise. But when you're still a few months out, the tendency in any negotiation is to try and be the holdout and hope the other party gives in. But I think it's that classic negotiation situation we find ourselves in, going back and forth with the same problem, and no one's really able to stand back and actually give a little away, particularly on the EU side, I would say.
Muddling on. Jasper Lawler, thank you so much for explaining that for us. Well, that's all for the show tonight. Now, Thursday night we've got Lord Hague, William Hague, and tomorrow night, Citi's global economist, Ebrahim Rabari. Until then, thanks for your company.